everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We are starting the top of the hour, so I want to welcome you to the NNLM, Social Determinants of Environmental Health webinar series. We are glad you're able to join us today for this session on PFAS and environmental health, information and tools for public health practitioners and information specialists. I'm your host, Cecilia Burns. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Coordinator for the NNLM, National Public Health Coordination Office. Assisting me today with technical aspects for today's session is Molly Knapp from the NNLM National Training Office, and our chat monitors are Javier Crespo, Justin de la Cruz, and Carolyn Martin. We just have a few technical items to cover before we get started. We have a live captioner today, and closed caption has been enabled. It's available by selecting Shows Caption at the bottom of the menu on your screen. Depending on the size of your screen, you may need to click on the three dots where it says More, and then select Captions. All attendees have been muted, but we welcome your questions and comments in the chat anytime. We will have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please be sure to select Everyone from the drop-down menu when posting your questions and comments in chat so everyone can see them. We're recording today's session and it will be available at various places, including the accompanying series guide in about a week or so. As a reminder, by registering for this webinar, all attendees have agreed to abide by the NNLM Code of Conduct. It's a reminder that we are all here together professionally, and we want to be inclusive and respectful. Your cooperation is appreciated. The Code of Conduct is also available on our website, and the link is posted in the chat. This class is eligible for one Medical Library Association continuing education credit, which you'll be able to claim through the evaluation link that will be available through the MLA CE code, which will be shared at the end of the session. The session is also eligible for competencies for health education specialists, or CHES. Just know that you will need your CHES ID to complete the evaluation. And speaking of that evaluation, your feedback is important to us and helps us improve future events. So please take a moment to complete it, whether or not you want the CE. Some of you are already familiar with us, but for those who aren't, I'd like to share a little about who we are. The National Institutes of Health is the nation's leading medical research agency. Many of you might be more familiar with the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the many institutes and centers at the NIH. NLM, or the National Library of Medicine, is one of the 27 institutes and offices of the National Institutes of Health. It's the world's largest biomedical library and produces online resources like PubMed and Medline Plus. NNLM, the network of the National Library of Medicine, is an outreach program of the NLM working to ensure health professionals and the public have equal access to information. NNLM is made up of 7 regional medical libraries, 3 national offices, and 4 national centers, all providing training, funding, and engagement opportunities to over 9,000 NNLM member organizations. Here's a map to show you how our regional medical libraries are geographically divided. If you'd like to learn more about your region and how your organization can become part of the network, visit our website at nnlm.gov and see the link posted in the chat. So on today's presentation, I'm very pleased to welcome our 2 presenters. Julia Waszewski is an assistant professor of environmental health at Northeastern University, and also has a joint appointment in the Department of Health Sciences Beauvais College of Health Sciences and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering College of Engineering. Specifically, her recent work highlights maternal-fetal exposure to toxicants during mid-gestation in relation to biomarkers of placental development and disease that are associated with maternal and fetal health complications. Julia earned her MPH and PhD in Environmental Health Sciences at the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health. Her dissertation research focused on developing methods for characterizing disparities in and evaluating dietary sources of cumulative phthalates exposure. Prior to graduate school, Julia facilitated scientific dialogue and research translation around developmental impacts of environmental contaminants as the Reproductive Health Working Group Coordinator for the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, CHE. Julia studied molecular biology as an undergraduate and contributed to laboratory research that improved chemical screening methods in water through microarray development. Alyssa Cordner is Associate Professor of Sociology and the Paul Garrett Fellow at Whitman College. She teaches courses in sociology and environmental studies. Alyssa's research focuses on environmental sociology, the sociology of risk and disasters, environmental health and justice and politics, and participation. Her two major areas of research are the social and political aspects of wildfire risk management and the social and scientific discoveries of perfluorinated chemicals. She has published articles in numerous journals as well as written and collaborated on books on environmental health and sociology topics. Alyssa Cordner is also the co-director of the PFAS Project Lab. PFAS are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances with researchers at Northeastern University. The lab focuses on social and scientific questions related to perfluorinated chemicals. Alyssa grew up in Oregon's Willamette Valley. She attended Bowdoin College and majored in sociology and French. She joined the faculty at Whitman in 2013, and in addition to her academic research, is a volunteer wildland firefighter with Walla Walla County Fire District Number 4. The title of their presentation is What Health Practitioners and Information Specialists Need to Know. Welcome, Alyssa and Julia. I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Well, yes, thank you again for having us. We're very excited to share a little bit about our research with a general focus on information about environmental health that will be useful to our audience today, and a focus on PFAS, the group of chemicals that we both study. The PFAS Project Lab is an interdisciplinary research group at Northeastern University, and we both produce original research, and we also do a lot of work to translate and transform existing data into products that are useful to a broad array of publics. In particular, a focus on communities that are highly impacted by PFAS. And what we'll do today is talk a little bit about environmental health generally with a focus on toxic chemicals or toxicants. Then we'll dive into PFAS as our case study with a little bit of an overview on this group of chemicals. We'll talk about 3 particular databases that might be useful or interesting to our audience today. And we'll finish up with some resources and hopefully plenty of time for question and answer, and maybe even playing around with some of those databases. And as Celia mentioned, I am an environmental sociologist. My research focuses on the very broad question of how we make decisions in the face of uncertainty, decisions about what we do, decisions about what we should do. And in the case of environmental issues, this uncertainty is ubiquitous. It involves all scales of action, from individual level experiences all the way up to what happens at an international scale. And it involves both behaviors and also norms or expectations. If you want to click through a couple of images, Julia, I previously worked on flame retardant chemicals and published that in a book called Toxic Safety. I also work, as was mentioned, on wildland fire with a focus on how policies designed to protect firefighters and protect the public and protect resources, how those policies develop and change and with what consequences. And then today, of course, I'll be talking about my work with the PFAS Project Lab.
Great. Thank you. And so, hi, everyone. I'm Julia Brashofsky. I'm an environmental health scientist and an environmental epidemiologist, which basically means that I have interdisciplinary expertise in exposure assessment, environmental toxicology, and environmental epidemiology. And I also am very passionate about and committed to translating science and translating my research into action. So my main focus is on environmental exposures and how they relate to maternal and child health effects across the life course. So what I do is I look at exposure sources and how those relate to chemical levels in the body, how those chemical levels in the body impact or perturb biological pathways and like placental disruption or endocrine disruption, oxidative stress and inflammation, then how those perturbations relate to clinical or subclinical outcomes, maternal child health outcomes, including pregnancy outcomes, cognitive and behavioral outcomes, growth and metabolism, or outcomes related to cardio and metabolic function. And then again, I'm very committed to translating research along that, along all aspects of that research into action. All right, so I think at this point we're going to, we've been asked to remove the video. I'm going to do that now. And we are going to begin. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of environmental health and environmental toxicants. And so environmental health in a nutshell is basically how the environment impacts human health rather than the other way around. And the environment can mean a lot of different things because we are exposed to many different chemical and non-chemical stressors throughout our daily lives. And that's true from the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the products we use, and the social context in which we live. It can also include things like where we work or where we're from, our genetic traits, and perhaps also even what environmental and social stressors our parents and grandparents were exposed to. So these factors are all interconnected, and they can each affect our susceptibility or vulnerability to disease across our lifetimes, as well as our resilience in the face of cumulative exposures and their potential health implications. The reason why I'm highlighting here a picture of a pregnant person is because pregnancy is really considered a critical, or perhaps the most critical, period of development for both the fetus and the pregnant individual. So exposures during this time can really influence maternal and child health outcomes across the entire life course. And even though the environment can mean a lot of different things, much of the focus of environmental health has really been on chemical exposures. And that has a lot to do with the fact that since World War II and over the past few decades, chemical production has really increased dramatically. This is data from the U.S. Federal Reserve Board showing a 23.5-fold increase in chemical production between 1945 and 2007. And that has a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution and the increase in the production of synthetic materials since World War II, which has really been instrumental to modern day living. But in consequence, there are now more than 80,000 synthetic chemicals on the market, many of which are commonly used in everyday household products, including food products, food packaging materials, flooring and building materials, things like shower curtains, medical equipment, baby products, and even children's toys. And we have limited or no toxicity data on most of those chemicals, most of the chemicals in U.S. commerce. And that's really because of the way U.S. chemicals policy works. There's really no requirement for toxicity testing prior to releasing chemicals in U.S. commerce. However, there are some high production volume chemicals that have gotten a lot of attention in recent years because of their widespread use and potential to impact human health. Some chemicals that you may have heard of more recently include things like phthalates, which are often used to soften plastic. They're found in food contact materials and personal care products like fragrances and nail polish. Phenols like bisphenol A or BPA and its replacements, which have been used in the lining of canned foods, thermal receipts, and hard or polycarbonate water bottles. Flame retardants like polybrominated diphenyl ethers or OPFRs. Heavy metals like lead and mercury. And then we have per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. Again, we're going to be going into more detail about that during this talk, but they're typically used for their stain and water resistant properties. And so as a result of all this widespread use of these chemicals, they are unsurprisingly found ubiquitously in our bodies. Biomonitoring studies of the U.S. population have shown us that the majority of people, including pregnant individuals, as you can see in this graph, have measurable levels of various synthetic chemicals in their bodies, including phthalates, including flame retardants, and PFAS, although that's not included in this graph, and others. And that is why, as the National Cancer Institute recently put it, babies are now effectively born pre-polluted with body burden levels of many of these synthetic chemicals in their bodies at birth. And we're concerned about that because many of these chemicals are biologically active compounds that can interfere with the molecular signaling that governs human life and biology. And we're especially vulnerable to the effects of these compounds during periods of extreme biological or developmental change, such as in utero, during puberty, and during pregnancy. So just like with pregnant individual and developing fetuses, babies and children are more sensitive to chemical exposures when their bodies are actively developing. And you can also imagine that biological changes while we age may also be sensitive to these compounds. And one type of biologically active compound are endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. And these are chemicals that can interfere with the molecular signaling that orchestrates human reproduction and human development and function. And EDCs as a whole have been linked to a wide range of health impacts across the life course, from cancer to asthma to infertility and neurodevelopmental problems. And the U.S. disease cost from EDCs has recently been estimated to be $340 billion, with PBDEs and phthalates cited as the leading drivers of that burden. And that's namely due to their early childhood effects on neurodevelopment in the case of PBDEs and fetal effects on reproductive development in the case of phthalates. And PFAS have also been recently implicated in that burden for their impacts on low birth weight. And we've also seen rising trends, concerning trends over the last few decades in adverse reproductive health outcomes, like reduced sperm count and quality, like increased testicular cancer and infertility. And these rising trends have really not been sufficiently explained by either increased reporting, genetics, nutritional factors, other lifestyle or behavioral factors that we often attribute to disease, which suggests there may be some environmental component like EDCs that really deserves further study. And this is just an article that came out a few years ago highlighting a systematic review and meta-analysis of over 100 studies in several countries, including the US, which showed a more than 50% decline in sperm count over the last 40 years, indicating the possibility that we are less fertile than our grandparents were. Other concerning trends that haven't really been sufficiently explained by those known factors like genetics, lifestyle, or increased diagnostics include pregnancy complications with preeclampsia increasing in younger pregnant individuals in the United States, increases in gestational diabetes and diabetes, other cardiometabolic conditions like obesity and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Learning and developmental disabilities like autism spectrum disorders are also on the rise, as well as autoimmune disease and various cancers. So there's a lot of work that we can do to study and intervene on these modifiable environmental chemical exposures. And I will turn it now over to Dr. Cordner to dive a little deeper into PFAS as a case study.
Great. Thank you, Julia. I will focus on a very broad overview of PFAS as a case study of environmental health concern. And we'll go quickly through this just to allow time for the rest of the presentation, but we're very happy to answer PFAS-specific questions during Q&A. PFAS are a very large class of chemicals, and there's no universally approved or valid recognized definition of what counts as a PFAS due to complexities in their chemical structures. But depending on how you define that chemical class, there could be over 14,000. This is from a definition used in one US EPA database. So we're talking not just about a handful of chemicals, but about many thousands of compounds. PFAS are a concern because of the combination of persistence, bioaccumulation, mobility, and toxicity. So they're highly persistent in the environment and in the human body. They're bioaccumulative in wildlife, in many different species, also in people. They're very mobile in water, which allows them to be both a persistent and a mobile contaminant of surface water and groundwater, which ultimately then impacts people's drinking water and water for many different species. And as a result of this, we have really ubiquitous exposure to these chemicals. Over 99% of people have detectable measured levels of PFAS in their blood. And this is important because we don't have analytic methods for all 14,000 or more PFAS. We have methods for a few dozen individual compounds. And so if we're talking about detecting even that small number of PFAS in nearly everyone's bodies, that should give us significant cause for concern. We have such ubiquitous exposure because these chemicals are very broadly used, very widely used for their properties. If you want to go to the next slide, Julia. PFAS are used in countless consumer products and in over 200 distinct use categories, according to one study. You might be very familiar with these uses, things like nonstick cookware, things like waterproof clothing or water-resistant clothing, a water-resistant carpet or stain-resistant carpet. Any textile that has a water or stain-resistant quality, odds are that quality was imparted with PFAS. PFAS are also very widely used in different industrial processes, including things like metal plating. They're used as surfactants for mining and fracking operations. They are used in all types of product production uses, and they are used in a particular type of firefighting foam, Class B foams, which are used to extinguish flammable fuel fires. So think about an oil or gas fire. You want to have a firefighting foam that spreads out very effectively. PFAS have really excellent surfactant qualities that allow them to become very efficient additives to these firefighting foams. If you want to go to the next slide. So the combination of the persistence and bioavailability of these compounds, their widespread use, we add to that many concerns about human health impacts. According to Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who is the retired director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program, PFAS affect virtually every organ system. And so we're not talking about a single type of health effect. We're talking about multiple types of cancers, impacts to many different systems within the body, such as the liver, the kidney, reproductive systems. There are associations between PFAS exposure and different reproductive outcomes. And Julia will talk a little bit more about how we're thinking about this with her database, the PFAS-Tox Database. If you want to go to the next slide. And so how has society responded? There has been a growth in public awareness, in media attention, of course, in scientific attention, and bringing all those things together, we've seen a lot of changes in the regulation of these chemicals in the past decade or so. And so recently we've seen proposals at the federal level to list two PFAS, PFOA and PFOS under the Superfund Act. We also see some proposals to add certain PFAS to RCRA. We have proposals underway to create regulatory drinking water levels for 6 PFAS listed here. Those proposals came out last March, and we're still waiting for the finalization of those drinking water proposals. But that would be very significant because at this point, there's no federally enforceable drinking water standard for any PFAS. As a result of this general vacuum in federal regulation, a number of states have enacted either enforceable or advisory advisory levels for PFAS in drinking water. You see here a screenshot from one of the maps in our PFAS sites and community resources map that we'll show you in a bit, that looks, the darker blue states have regulatory levels for certain PFAS, while the lighter blue states have some sort of guidance or advisory level, and then the states that are not shaded have no PFAS drinking water guidelines whatsoever. So we've seen quite a range in PFAS regulatory approaches at the state and federal level, and this has been one of our research projects at the PFAS Project Lab. We'll talk more about that in a moment.
Great. And so one way that we are really trying to wrangle or systemize the data on PFAS to help inform these efforts to understand and mitigate the harms of PFAS is through the PFAS-Tox Database. So the PFAS-Tox Database is a systematic evidence map of over 1,000 studies on any and all health and toxicology outcomes related to PFAS. It is an online searchable database that is intended to be very user-friendly. It's been updated through January 2021 at this point and includes multiple evidence streams, including human studies, animal studies, and in vitro studies. It's a joint project between myself and collaborators at other institutions and was originally started by Katie Pelch and Carol Kwiatkowski at the former nonprofit, the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, or TEDx, and Anna Reed at Natural Resources Defense Council. But it has since evolved and sort of found a new home in the PFAS Project Lab at Northeastern University. And I want to acknowledge Abigail Blind, who is one of our postdocs at Northeastern, who's really been leading this work. So you can link to the database at the URL at the bottom right of the screen, pfastoxdatabase.org. And then if you click on the word database up at the top right of that screen, it takes you to this user-friendly searchable interface. And so here is where you can search for human studies in green. You see at the top right, the green button. You can search for or versus animal studies in blue and in vitro studies in orange. You can also search just under that. You can also search for early life effects, where you see this baby face emoji where it says also early life effects. And then under that, you can also search for author conflicts of interest, where it says financial conflict of interest. And you can download abstracts and other study details at the download study list button here at the bottom right. And that gives you a really nice Excel or CSV file with many different variables of interest that we extracted from each study. And one thing that's not on this sort of pop-up screen here is that the list of references in this box on the right-hand side of your screen, all the list of references. If you hover over any one of those in a live session, you'll a pop-up will pop up that shows the abstract and all these other details that are extracted in that Excel and CSV file, but individually for each study. Happy to do a live demo during the Q&A if that's helpful, but let's keep moving through this so you can get a feel for it. So on the very left-hand side, where the red circle is, it says studies on 29 PFAS, and these are the list of studies, or excuse me, the list of PFAS that are currently included in the database. To the right of that is a column that says total. That lists all the total studies for each compound. So for PFNA, you'll see 631 total studies in the database. And the reason why it only includes 29 PFAS at this point in phase 1 is because we decided to focus the first phase of the database on the emerging and newer generation replacement PFAS that we thought were most relevant for current decision-making contexts. But I will say that we have since decided to add legacy PFAS from Melissa's talk on PFOA and PFOS that are considered, older generation legacy PFAS, but are highly persistent in the environment. We've decided to add those, and that update should be available by the end of June of this year. And so let's say, just looking at this, we're going to do a little more on the next slide, but just looking at this, let's say I was interested in all studies on the endocrine system for PFNA, this first PFAS here listed, I would go to the, oh, and that's what I forgot to say actually. The top rows here, the top columns, are the health outcome categories or groupings that we organized all the data into. So you see metabolic and digestive system and body weight size and growth and endocrine system on the left, and then all the way down to cancers on the right. So let's say I was interested in all the studies related to PFNA and endocrine system. I can see just without even clicking on anything, there are 129 human studies, 49 animal studies, and 35 in vitro studies. Now let's say I'm interested in a compound like GenX. Here's GenX down here where it says 29 total studies. And I can just see by scrolling down this column here to the right, I can just see that there are no human studies in this database on GenX, which is informative in and of itself. So if I do a more specific search on all human cancer studies, I would click on the cancer endpoint up here, and then I would click on the human tab here, and I get all the human studies for all the PFAS in the database. So you can see there's 14 for PFNA and so forth. And you can already see that just by doing that, I already get some kind of summary information down here at the bottom, including some basic breakdown data on study design, on exposure type, whether it be non-occupational or occupational, on study location. And if you scroll down here, you can see a little more, but you also have the option, right, to click this download study list button. And when you click that, this box pops up and asks you what sort of format you wanted it. There are multiple options, including this heat map, but other options above. And I just want the study list themselves. So I click on that, and then I can either decide on Excel or CSV and click download. Then I get this file that looks something like this and includes this sort of information where you've got the authors, the type of study if you're doing more than one type, abstract, funding acknowledgement, COI information, the study design, the PFAS included, sample size, location, and also information about how exposure and outcome variables were measured, which is really important for determining bias and things like that in epidemiologic studies. And again, we can go into more about this during Q&A if people are interested, but I did want to just kind of run through some examples of how we're using the database in our work. So one way is we've been able to use the database to show that the number of studies on PFAS in all three evidence streams has really gone up dramatically over the last 10 years. And you can see in the graph on the top left, that's especially true here for human studies in green. And so out of those human studies, you can see here is a graph of the PFAS that are most often included in those studies. And you can also see that in the graph on the bottom right, that body weight size growth, reproductive, endocrine, and metabolic and digestive systems are the most commonly examined health outcome groupings in those studies. We also, and it's not shown here, but we also were able to determine that most human studies were cross-sectional or cohort study designs. So things like that have given us some really nice high-level information about PFAS research over the last few decades. And one of our collaborators at Silent Spring Institute, Dr. Laurel Shader, has also used the database to show that thus far the vast majority of those studies are on long chain or more like legacy, older generation PFAS versus the shorter chain, newer generation PFAS. We've also been using the database in our work to examine racial and ethnic demographics of epidemiologic study populations. And it's become clear doing that work that white participants in blue are disproportionately represented in epidemiologic PFAS studies, in this case involving reproductive health outcomes, compared to BIPOC participants. And most notably, there were very few studies that included Asian and or Pacific Islander study populations, and no study that explicitly included Native American participants in their study populations. We're also using the database as a platform from which to conduct rigorous systematic reviews on PFAS and various health outcomes of interest. We started with gestational diabetes and are applying elements of OHAT and UCSF's navigation guide frameworks for conducting systematic reviews on environmental data, and meta-analysis on both clinical and subclinical measures of gestational diabetes that have been examined in recent human observational studies. And the protocol for this is currently under review by the journal Environment International. We're also using the database to determine if human epi and experimental animal studies with a financial conflict of interest related to PFAS production use report industry favorable versus industry unfavorable results more frequently than studies without a financial COI. And this is represented in the figure on the right, but there are 109 animal and 41 human studies which report conflicts of interest thus far in the database. So that's 150 studies, and which is about 9%. And we are defining favorable. This is still a work in progress, and we're still making these determinations. But as of now, we're defining favorable as studies which either report no associations or effects or downplay the importance of effects that are reported by, say, writing them off as, due to methodological flaws or something like that. All right, and we've also used the database to conduct a comparative analysis of remediation studies on PFAS in soil or water and aqueous environments, and that's really to better understand the techniques and the technologies that are currently being developed and what the advantages and challenges of each are, so that we can better understand which are the most viable for actually scaling up from the lab to real-world applications, since we all know that the persistence of PFAS will remain a problem long after we're able to reduce the source of exposure. And I'll just end by giving some context for how others are using the database in their work. We've heard from various stakeholders in the field that the database has been and will continue to be useful in their work on, for example, supporting policy and advocacy efforts on PFAS in drinking water. We've heard from various toxicologists and risk assessors, as well as environmental lawyers and community members about that. We've also heard about its utility in informing these high-level decision-making type of contexts in the regulatory and clinical settings. It has been also linked to other relevant databases of interest and has provided content for hypothesis generation and things like preliminary literature reviews in the development of new research questions and things like that. So we hope it will also be useful for you as information specialists and public health practitioners, and would love to hear any feedback you might have. And with that, I will for now turn it over back to Alyssa.
Great. Thank you, Julia. I'm going to talk about two data sources that we have on the PFAS project website. So the first is our PFAS sites and community resources map. And this is an interactive map made through the ArcGIS Experience Map program. And the map itself, there's a shortened link there, and it has several different layers, including known contamination sites, presumptive contamination sites, community resources, which includes things like the location of community groups, and then the state action tab, which includes information like which states have drinking water advisory levels. And so this map is a result of some work we've been doing since 2016. If you want to go to the next slide, Julia. We started compiling a list of known contamination sites, of known places around the country where PFAS had been measured. And this just gives you a sense of how far PFAS research has come in less than a decade. When we started compiling this data in 2016, we started our first round with only 12 known sites. And these were sites that generally were linked to industry. So for example, the Washington Works plant or the Decatur, Alabama large chemical manufacturing facilities. This was generally before the large data release from the third round of the EPA's Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR, which included several PFAS and gave us the first kind of hint at how widespread PFAS contamination was in drinking water around the country. Since then, as you can see from this slide, we have expanded the database into almost 2,000 sites. Now, this is not, the sites on this list are not every single place where PFAS have been detected. We do not include individual drinking water systems on our database. All the entries in our database are known contamination sites with a known source of PFAS contamination. This would include things like military facilities that had used fluorinated AFFF, or industrial facilities that had released PFAS into the environment, fire training facilities, wastewater treatment plants with measurable PFAS levels. So these are all known contamination sites, known places where PFAS has been measured and can be linked to a particular source. And this database is fully accessible online. The shortened URL is here on the screen as well. And all this information is available as a sort of interactive Google Sheet. And we also do make this data available to researchers who want to use it. We have a user agreement that we share with folks, and if they are willing to read that and comply with it, then we're happy to share the actual underlying data as well. So this data then feeds into our map that you saw on the last slide. And if you want to go to the next slide, Julia, this shows kind of an example of what happens when you zoom into a particular location. So I am in Walla Walla, Washington, on the eastern side of the state. And there is a known contamination site at the Fairchild Air Force Base up near Spokane. And so maybe folks have, maybe you might have seen a news story like I have here in the bottom left. And you thought, oh, I wonder what's going on at this contamination site. You can look at the actual database, which is shown at the top, to see information about this contamination site, or you can zoom in on the map, and that same information pops up in a sort of a pop-up box there. So this is how the known contamination site and the map can be useful to folks, especially people who want to explore their community or other places that they might care about. If you want to go to the next slide, Julia. We also have developed a model of presumptive PFAS contamination. And this is the idea that because PFAS testing around the country and of course around the world has been very uneven, we don't actually know all of the locations that are contaminated with PFAS at the current time. And so we compiled existing research papers and regulatory documents that linked particular types of sites with known PFAS contamination. And this led us to identify 3 types of sites that we called presumptive PFAS contamination sites. And this means that in the absence of high quality testing data, we encourage decision makers to treat these types of sites as presumptively contaminated until testing can be done. Those include AFFF discharge sites, so the places where fluorinated firefighting foams have been used. It also includes certain types of industrial facilities that either produced or used PFAS. And it includes sites related to PFAS containing waste. And this could be wastewater treatment plants, sludge application sites, incinerators, etc. Now, in our research, we were able to gather high quality nationwide geolocation data for certain types of presumptive contamination sites. So for example, we were able to gather geolocation data on large airports, the Part 139 airports around the country. And so we're able to map those. But there are other types of of presumptive contamination sites for which high quality geolocation data does not exist, at least not at the nationwide scale. And so to give another example from the AFFF category, there's no nationwide data set that shows all the places where firefighters have trained with AFFF, or all of the airplane crash sites around the country where AFFF has been used. So what our presumptive contamination model does is say, here are the types of sites that we would argue should be presumed to be contaminated in the absence of high quality testing data. When we try to operationalize that model and actually create mappable data, we run up with a huge undercount of those actual facilities. We did compile as much data as we were able to gather and ended up identifying over 57,000 presumptive sites around the country. This was published in EF&T Letters in 2022. The entire data set is also publicly available, and if you're interested in it, we're happy to share if you email us. And if you go to the next slide, Julia, you can see here the difference between the volume of known contamination sites and the volume of presumptive contamination sites. You'll also see real inequalities in terms of the distribution of testing. So for example, New Hampshire looks like it is just a sort of pool of PFAS floating over the entire state. It's rather the case that New Hampshire has systematically tested for PFAS and then tracked down contamination to a known source of contamination. And so this really does speak to us the necessity of this presumptive PFAS contamination model because testing has been very uneven. And so, as I said, both of these data layers go into our PFAS sites and community resources map, which is on the internet. And also these data sets are available to researchers who are interested in using them or exploring the data. So if you want to go to the next slide, Julia. Another aspect of our work with the PFAS Project Lab has been tracking the growth of the growth and development of regulation and governance action around PFAS. Just as Julia mentioned, there has been a huge increase in scientific research on PFAS over the last maybe 10 years or so. There's been really an explosion of governance activity as well. So if you want to go to the next slide. We think about PFAS governance as including many different types of activities coming from the government. We talk about legislation in terms of bills and laws, regulatory activity. These are things promulgated by regulatory agencies in individual states or at the federal level. Those agencies can also produce non-regulatory initiatives. These might be voluntary programs or things like the drinking water advisory levels that don't have regulatory teeth, but still might be influential. We also talk about peri-governmental work in which the governing work is actually done outside of the state, but then can be incorporated into the state in meaningful ways. So for example, there are independent standard setting organizations that develop fire safety standards that then get incorporated into municipal codes in a regulatory capacity. Governance happens at multiple scales, of course, from the international scale all the way down to the local. And there are many topics of governance activities relevant in the PFAS world, if you want to go to the next slide. And so starting in 2021, we began to compile a database of PFAS governance actions. And we're grateful to our funders and also grateful to the nonprofit organization Safer States for sharing some useful data with us. If you want to go to the next slide, we compiled this into a very non-user-friendly database that quickly became much more complicated and difficult to work with than we knew we could release to the public. And so this gives you just a little bit of a preview into what that looks like in our internal version. If you go to the next slide, Julia, starting in the summer of 2023, we worked with computer scientists at Whitman College and created a publicly available interactive website. So, and this is at governance.pfasproject.com. When you load the website, you'll get this informational screen that has information about the website, how to use it, information about how we compile the data, and also a discussion of limitations of this database, as well as a form for submitting additional suggestions or corrections to the database. When you click out of it, and it does take a second to load because the website loads all over 1,000 entries all at once. So when you click out of it, if you go to the next slide, Julia, you'll be shown all of the results, and you'll see in that upper right-hand corner, I hope you can still hear me. If you can't, just put a note in the I got a note that my internet is unstable, so hopefully you can still hear me. On the right-hand side there, you'll see that I've circled the number of results. This shows you that at this point, the website loads all over 1,000 entries in the governance database. And as you then filter the results on the left-hand side, that number in the right-hand side will decrease. There are lots of different ways you can filter the data. You can ask for just federal action or just state action. You can ask for a specific federal agency. So you could ask the website to show me everything that the Food and Drug Administration has done. Or you can select particular states. Maybe you want to look at states in your region. Or maybe you care a lot about states, about one particular state. You can select by state. You can limit the date range. We have entries going back to the 90s and then up till 2024, so you can limit the dates. You can choose the type of action. This would be, is it a legislative action, regulatory, non-regulatory, or perigovernmental. You can select particular topics. We have over 35 topics in the database, ranging, as the previous slide showed, from things like air to fishing game, cleanup requirements, data and data production requirements, lots of different topics. For legislation, you can select particular outcomes. So you can ask for only those legislation entries that were ultimately passed. And there's a couple different categories there because legislation can be passed and signed, it can be passed and fully vetoed, it can be passed and partially vetoed. There are a few different options there. And then you can also sort, for example, by date. So those are all the ways that you can kind of manipulate this database, which again is at governance.pfasproject.com, so that you can find governance activities that are useful to you. And with that, I will turn it back to Julia.
Great. So we just wanted to provide a few resources as we end here and get into the Q&A. So the PFAS Project Lab resources that we've shared with you, there's the the general PFASproject.com website that gives a lot of more information. The PFAS-Tox Database specifically, again, can be found at PFAS-ToxDatabase.org. PFAS Contamination Tracker, the link for that is here, as well as the governance tracker that Alyssa just mentioned, and just reminders about what those entail here that you can look back on. We also wanted to provide a few other resources that we thought might be helpful in general. The PFASexchange.org website includes a lot of resources and fact sheets related to PFAS. Silent Spring Institute is an important research organization in this work. And same with the Collaborative for Health and Environment, or CHE, and the Green Science Policy Institute. And then the NASM guidance on PFAS testing and health outcomes, the clinical guidance that recently came out on PFAS, is a wonderful resource that we also recommend for this audience. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and we will turn it over for Q&A.
I do have one question as people think of a question. With regard to funding, is there continued support for these three databases to be continuously updated on a given cycle?
Well, that's a wonderful. I'll start on that. So for the PFAS-Tox database, we did get funding to update the database with PFOA and PFOS, which I mentioned in my talk was going to be done by the end of June of this year. But in terms of updating the whole database, our goal is to do that every couple of years. We don't have great sources of funding for that kind of work. A lot of private family foundations don't necessarily fund that sort of maintenance type of role. And NIH funding and other sources of funding it's not the most exciting thing to fund as well. So if anyone actually on this call has tips for the kind of translational funding that would require, I think that would be really wonderful for the PFAS-Tox database. And I'll let Alyssa respond for the others.
Yeah, so we have had we've had a series of 3 grants from the National Science Foundation that have supported different aspects of our work. So a previous project looked at the social and scientific discovery, and that's the project that let us create the original, the known PFAS contamination site database. We're currently funded for a project looking at PFAS governance, and part of that grant was to create and maintain this, the governance database. We have been very fortunate to have a wonderful series of full-time research assistants through Northeastern University, which has a program called the co-op program. Julia, you might understand co-ops better than I do since I'm not actually at Northeastern, but my understanding is it basically is a work experience for students during their 4 years of college or during their undergraduate degree. And so co-op students work and are paid for 35 hours a week of work as part of their co-op process. And there are a few different entities within Northeastern that have paid for part or all of the salary of those co-ops. And so those students do a lot of the daily maintenance. I didn't mention our website, but we have daily news updates on our website that feed into other PFAS-oriented websites as well, like PFAS Central, which is another great news source or general website for PFAS information. So our students update the website every day. They add and update information into these databases, which it does take a lot of work. And one of the challenges we always run into is, well, how can we continue to do more while also ensuring that the data sets that we have are as fully accurate, as complete and as accurate as possible. And so at this point, we've been able to continually update these databases with the combination of NSF support to create new projects and then Northeastern support to continue the maintenance of existing projects. That has led us to make some decisions about what information to include. So for example, earlier versions of the known PFAS contamination site database had both the known contamination sites and also a separate compilation of drinking water testing information. And that was feasible in the, in 2017, 2018, when very few states were doing PFAS testing. But as more and more states started doing their own systematic drinking water investigations, it was no longer feasible for us to continually compile that data without dedicated funding, which we didn't have. And so we made the decision to focus just on the known contamination sites, and we've been able to maintain that up to this point. I think going forward, our sort of short and medium term intention is certainly to maintain these information sources, and long term, we would evaluate whether the need is still there and whether it's a good use of our resources to maintain them. But at this point, we're able to continually maintain them.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We do have some questions that have come up. The first one, how can researchers from other institutions contribute to your research?
Well, I would say we work collaboratively across multiple institutions and fields with a range of different people, and so we're always interested to collaborate or work with folks. And I think it would just take an email and maybe setting up a time to chat and see how we can work together. For us, when we do our database updates, it does take a team of people. Alyssa mentioned the co-op program at Northeastern, and I certainly take advantage of that as an assistant professor here. We have an army of undergrads that are working on the database, but having higher level information health science experts on the team is a hugely beneficial. So I could definitely see a role for some kind of collaborative partnership.
Yeah, I would agree. And then I would also add that in addition to actual collaborations, which we're always excited to talk about, we're also just very excited to share data. And so, as I mentioned, we have databases of known contamination sites and the presumptive contamination, and we're happy to share those. We have a user agreement that is it's very straightforward. And so you also are welcome to just ask for data in terms of the contamination sites. The governance database as well, I should have mentioned this, but the governance database website, you can download all of your results. And so you can do whatever search you're interested in, and then download the results as a CSV file, and just use those results and as for whatever purposes you want. And we include information about how then to cite the data. And so you're welcome to use the data without forming a formal collaboration. And if you're interested in more interactive work, we'd be very happy to hear from you.
Great, thank you for that.
And that includes also sharing data with students. We've shared the data with lots of graduate students as well.
Great. More specific questions. Are there immediate actions that state cancer prevention and control programs can do in regard to PFAS education and policy? And I think I can answer part of this, is that having followed this since a New Hampshire conversation I had with a state epidemiologist, your newsletter is sent out monthly from the project, and that has advocacy organizations that are listed in collaboration, and there are the PFAS conferences that have happened in the past where connections can be made between advocacy organizations that educate as well as inform.
Excellent. Yeah, I just put the link to our newsletter in the chat. And the next National PFAS Conference is coming up in June, June 10th to 12th in Ann Arbor. And I can find the website and put that in as well. I'll also say one of the websites that Julia put up on the resources page, the PFAS Exchange, has a wealth of very user-friendly resources, fact sheets, information for clinicians. And so that might be some very useful information as well.
I was just going to add, there might also be some useful information coming out of, I think it's ATSD, or no, IARC. IARC recently had a call for data this last fall for cancer studies related to PFOA and PFOS that may be useful for that work going forward. But the cancer is an area we've been interested in trying to leverage the database to try to inform some of the community efforts, organizing efforts around cancer, because that's sort of been identified to us as a need that we can help fill. So, but yeah, let's see.
Great, thank you so much for that. Couple of other comments and questions are coming up. There is one asking about practical suggestions, but it looks like the resources you've mentioned, such as Silent Spring and the PFAS Exchange, would have those. I would also mention that Medline Plus probably may have some links to PFAS exposure mitigation, and I would suggest looking at those to get more information, but also look at the resources that are listed. As an organization, we can't actually give advice per se, but we can also point you to the information that may have helpful details on following up on that. There is a question about other countries. Are there other countries who have been more progressive in their recommendations regard to PFAS monitoring education? Personally, I know that PFAS is being found all over. And I'm seeing different kinds of levels of response. Could you comment on that? I know this is a US-focused database, such as the governance database and the known contamination sites, but what have you learned from your international community?
I'll put in another website. This is the Forever Pollution Project, which was led by a team of journalists originally at Le Monde, and then it expanded to include dozens of investigative journalists around the European Union. And this project used our known and contamination site model to develop similar sort of parallel databases for the European Union. And I think that often when we think about regulatory protections around chemical toxicants in particular, there certainly is a lot of attention to the European Union because their program, the REACH program, which is sort of parallel to our TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, It does have a higher sort of data requirement for the evaluation of chemical risk and safety, and it has higher burdens on chemical producers to develop and share data. And so there are lots of there are many ways in which that European Union system is more precautionary in terms of environmental health protection. Within the EU, there have been individual countries that have acted more quickly. And so there are individual countries that have developed drinking water levels. For example, Denmark has been more proactive on PFAS testing and drinking water remediation than the EU as a whole. Up until this point. And so in terms of international work, the EU or Australia has also done some regulatory work on the PFAS front, although they have different screening levels as well. I wouldn't say that any country has figured it out, though, in terms of health protection from PFAS. And in terms of addressing the contamination crisis from a more protective way, if we're not treating the upstream sources of PFAS, and in particular focusing on reducing the ongoing and new emissions of virtually all PFASs and virtually all uses, we will continue to be experiencing these problems because of the incredible persistence and long life, the foreverness of this class of chemicals. And so we really do need to be thinking about upstream protections, including dramatic reductions on the production and use of chemicals, of PFAS chemicals.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and for your time with us during this Q&A. So for our additional engagement time, we're going to be using something called a Padlet. So basically each question of the first three going from left to right is basically asking, do you find that there's a way you could use one of the databases during the presentation that was discussed? And then the fourth question is more of a brainstorm to say, what would you like to see in a future database? What kind of data would it have on PFAS, and maybe what would you call it? Thank you for attending today and participating, and thank you to our guest speakers for a wonderful presentation. We hope to see you at future sessions.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.